In the previous program, I discussed the U.S. China Trade War 2.0, including Trump's key policies and their potential effects on China. Naturally, Xi Jinping is not one to sit idly by and take the blows. In response to the Trump 2.0 era, Xi will surely adopt countermeasures. Hi, I'm Dongxiang. Welcome to Digging to China, where we explore China in depth to uncover insights you won't find elsewhere. In this episode, we turn our focus back to China to explore how Xi Jinping might react to Trump's Trade War 2.0 and the potential impact of his responses. First, let me share a perspective. I believe many, including major media outlets, are underestimating the potential intensity of this U.S.-China trade war. Much of this stems from underestimating Trump's resolve, assuming he wouldn't impose a final 60% tariffs. However, I think an equally important factor being overlooked is Xi Jinping. What people are underestimating now is not Trump's resolve, but Xi Jinping's determination to strike back. Many believe that even if Trump raises tariffs and the U.S.-China Trade War 2.0 begins, China's response will be similar to the first round, that the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping will avoid escalating the trade war, opting for more measured tactics instead of directly confronting Trump. What do we mean by measured tactics? A classic example is avoiding direct confrontation with the US by altering product categories and rerouting trade. For instance, during the first trade war when the US imposed multiple rounds of tariffs on China, these tariffs were focused on specific products. In response, some Chinese traders circumvented the tariffs by changing the product categories. Items like clothing, shoes, and luggage, which were heavily taxed by Trump, were reclassified as other textiles or complete sets of goods with lower tariffs. This shift in product categories allowed them to partially avoid the impact of the tariffs. Additionally, China has long used the transshipment trade to circumvent these challenges. For instance, China now routes goods through countries like Mexico and Vietnam to avoid tariffs. In 2023, exports to Vietnam and Mexico nearly doubled compared to 2017, which is an unusually large increase, particularly with Mexico. Mexico's relationship with China hasn't notably improved, and its economy hasn't seen significant growth. So why the sharp rise in exports to Mexico? Clearly, many of these goods are being funneled through Mexico to the US. Furthermore, China has been rapidly increasing factory construction and direct investment in these transshipment countries. For example, Chinese investment in Mexico has soared since the U.S.-China trade war began. Trump has taken note of this trend, which is why he has announced plans to impose tariffs on Mexico and Vietnam when he returns to office. During this period, China did impose some retaliatory tariffs against the US, but these measures were relatively mild. Overall, during the first trade war, China adopted a Tai Chi-like approach, relying on flexible methods to counter the US while trying to prevent the conflict from escalating further. China also made some concessions to Trump, such as pledging to import more soybeans. While this promise was never fully carried out, the intention to compromise was evident. On the other hand, the US treated its dealings with China like a game of whack-a-mole. Whenever China exploited a loophole, the US would find a way to close it. This dynamic, coupled with the unexpected arrival of the pandemic, led to production shutdowns across the US and other parts of the world, driving up demand for Chinese goods. As a result, the impact of the U.S.-China Trade War 1 seemed relatively mild. The negative effects were not strongly felt by the Chinese public, and most didn't feel that their lives in 2018 or 2019 became noticeably harder due to the trade war. Many might therefore assume that this time will follow a similar pattern, with the Chinese Communist Party responding to the US in much the same way. China playing Tai Chi and the US playing whack-a-mole. After the US implements large-scale tariffs, China is expected to retaliate symbolically and then employ various unconventional tactics to circumvent the US sanctions. But I believe this time is different because we've overlooked one key factor: Xi Jinping's resolve. I don't think Xi will respond with the same Tai Chi approach as before to Trump's trade war. Instead, there is a strong possibility that he will choose to confront Trump head-on. We often misinterpret the views of China's leadership. For instance, we often hear opinions in Chinese society about China's rise as a global power, the superiority of its system, or claims that the Plaza Accord destroyed Japan. Our first instinct is to dismiss these as mere propaganda used by the CCP to manipulate the public, assuming that no one in the leadership truly believes them. But sometimes we must ask, are these ideas really just tools for brainwashing? I don't think so. The ideas mentioned above aren't just public propaganda, they are likely shared by the CCP leadership. This is evident from Xi Jinping's policies and his personal statements. He truly believes in this ideology. Xi Jinping is, in fact, China's biggest pink nationalist. He is the leader of China's pink nationalism movement. Following this logic, if Xi Jinping were to respond to Trump's trade war with a Tai Chi approach once again, would he view China as potentially facing a fate similar to Japan's? After all, in Xi Jinping's perspective, Japan's decline wasn't caused by internal problems, but by exploitation by the U.S. Likewise, Xi might argue that China's current struggles are not due to the decay of the Communist Party system, but rather the result of U.S. pressure. In Xi Jinping's perspective, Japan's decline was driven by the U.S. aggressively reversing the trade surplus between the two countries. Trump's Trade War 2.0 aims to do the same thing. If Xi continues to handle the U.S. with a Tai Chi approach, while China's trade surplus may not be drastically overtuned like Japan's, it could still lead China into a situation similar to Japan's. As a result, Xi is likely to avoid such a scenario at all costs. It's important to point out that the idea Japan's decline was solely caused by the Plaza Accord is a mistaken perspective. Furthermore, as I mentioned in the previous episode, Trump represents a trend of isolationism and anti-globalization. If this anti-globalization movement takes hold, it would undermine the very foundation of China's development, since China's growth has largely been driven by globalization. In Xi Jinping's eyes, surrender is never an option. The last time he chose to retreat, it was because his power within the party was not yet fully consolidated. After all, Xi had only been in office for 6 or 7 years, and China was not ready for a full-scale confrontation with the US at that time. However, the situation is different now. Xi has firmly consolidated his power at the top and over the past few years has been preparing China for a potential conflict with the US. For instance, following the previous trade war, Xi launched the Made in China 2025 initiative to reduce China's reliance on US high-end manufacturing. This initiative has been progressing and has achieved some success. Additionally, Xi has ramped up support for industries like semiconductors, aiming to break free from dependence on the US chip industry. Beyond the high-tech industries, Xi Jinping has also been taking steps to lessen China's dependence on the US in other areas. For instance, China's imports of soybeans from the US have significantly decreased. In 2016, over 40% of China's soybeans came from the US, but by the first 9 months of this year, that share had dropped to under 18%. These are just a few examples of the behind-the-scenes preparations Xi has made over the years. I believe Xi Jinping's approach to the trade war this time will likely be very different from the last. While there may be some early negotiations with the US, these talks will likely collapse quickly, prompting China to retaliate with a comprehensive counterattack. I believe Xi Jinping's primary methods of retaliation at this stage are as follows. The first potential response is currency devaluation, which is considered the most likely approach at this stage. Since the onset of the last trade war, China has been actively devaluing the yuan, effectively lowering the price of Chinese exports. However, the previous devaluation was relatively modest, aimed mainly at stabilizing exports. This time, in response to Trump's 60% tariffs, China is unlikely to settle for a minor devaluation of 10% or 20%. It is highly probable that China will take a more drastic step, devaluing the yuan significantly, potentially driving the exchange rate to 1 to 10 or even 1 to 11 or 1 to 12. This would not be a difficult task for China as the yuan's exchange rate is largely controlled by the Chinese government. This approach contrasts sharply with Japan's experience during the Plaza Accord, which forced the yen to appreciate. A sharp devaluation of the yuan would render Trump's plan to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. through tariffs ineffective. By significantly lowering the yuan's value, China could easily counteract the impact of the 60% tariffs, effectively neutralizing the price increase. China's exports would also become much more competitive in Europe due to the devaluation. In this scenario, with the high wages of U.S. workers, the ideas of relocating manufacturing back to the U.S. would struggle to compete on cost. Even if Xi Jinping doesn't take an aggressive approach in responding to the US, it's almost certain that the yuan devaluation will occur, just as it did during the previous trade war. The key difference now is the scale of the devaluation. A more assertive response from Xi would lead to a larger devaluation, while a more cautious approach would result in a smaller one. Another measure Xi Jinping is likely to take is reciprocal tariffs. If the US imposes tariffs on Chinese goods, China will respond by applying similar tariffs to American products. While this retaliation could provide some pressure, the impact might be limited due to the nature of the products China imports from the US. China's imports from the US primarily include technology products, energy resources, and agricultural goods. Among these, agricultural and energy products are relatively easier for the US to separate from and are simpler for China to target with tariffs. However, imposing tariffs on high-tech products is more challenging. This is because, in many cases, it's not that China doesn't want to purchase these products, but rather that the US may not be willing to sell them. As a result, China's retaliatory actions are likely to avoid focusing heavily on tariffs in the high-tech sector. Another form of retaliation that could resemble tariffs would involve targeting U.S. companies operating in China. This could include actions such as detaining American executives, imposing restrictions on their business activities, or increasing regulatory scrutiny. While some of these measures are already being implemented, they are likely to escalate sharply once the trade conflict with the U.S. intensifies. At the same time, American companies operating and selling in China like Apple and Tesla are expected to face challenges. However, I don't foresee China directly expelling these companies as they play a significant role in providing jobs and supporting the growth of China's industrial supply chains. Nevertheless, China will likely not allow these companies to operate without increased oversight or pressure. I believe a more likely course of action would be for the Chinese government to encourage nationalism and mobilize some segments of the population to criticize and reject American products. For example, campaigns could promote the idea that using Apple products is unpatriotic and that supporting Huawei is a patriotic choice. Over the past few years, the government has fostered a group of nationalists, making it easier to drive such sentiments. This would likely target industries where China already has local alternatives like electric vehicles and smartphones. On the other hand, sectors like graphics cards, where China still lacks a sufficient domestic supply, wouldn't be as affected. Another likely countermeasure China will take is restricting supply chains to the U.S. Unlike during the previous trade war, China has significantly strengthened its position over the years. Today, China holds a strong advantage in key industries such as rare earth minerals and green energy. These sectors provide China with leverage to limit U.S. access, potentially disrupting critical industries that depend on these resources. Recently, China took a small step in exercising this supply chain influence. A company named Skydio, which had been selling drones to Ukraine and Taiwan, was hit with sanctions from China. As a result, Skydio can no longer source drones batteries made in China. This move highlights China's significant leverage, especially in the green energy sector, where it holds a strong supply chain advantage. However, in the realm of green energy, Trump is not particularly concerned, as he even questions the existence of global warming. So the impact in this area should be minimal. However, China's control over some key minerals and rare earths is undeniable. China holds around 70% of the global rare earth production, and while other countries are trying to catch up, the gap remains significant. These are the countermeasures we can currently foresee, though there may be others we haven't yet anticipated. We'll have to wait for the policies to unfold to see what else might emerge. In early 2018, the Trump administration wrapped up its investigation into China's intellectual property practices and warned that the tariffs would be imposed if China did not make immediate concessions. At the time, many believed Trump was merely bluffing and that he wouldn't follow through with the tariffs, thinking it would harm the U.S. economy. However, Trump ultimately imposed the tariffs, proving that many had underestimated his resolve. Now, no one doubts Trump's determination, but I think this time people are underestimating Xi Jinping's resolve. Many believe Xi will respond to Trump as he did before, with a more subtle approach. However, I think this time will be different. Xi is likely to respond with a far more direct and forceful strategy. Of course, Trump is not one to back down easily, and in response to these countermeasures, he'll likely escalate with even stronger retaliation. I don't believe this trade war will end with a 60% tariff. Unlike the past patterns of tariff decreasing through negotiations, I foresee a scenario where the 60% tariff is implemented, China responds with firm countermeasures, and the tariffs continue to rise, leading both sides toward an eventual breakdown in talks. Certainly, China's strong countermeasures will carry significant costs for its people. For instance, forcing the currency to devalue will undoubtedly affect ordinary citizens, as a weaker yuan would reduce their purchasing power. Restricting rare earth exports could further squeeze already narrow profit margins in China's rare earth sector. Additionally, stoking nationalism could drive more foreign investment out, leading to a further loss of jobs for the Chinese population. Of course, it's not that Trump's countermeasures won't hurt the U.S. economy, but the U.S. has a much stronger economic base. In my view, this trade war will ultimately become a contest of national strength, but each side is competing in different areas. The U.S. is leveraging its superior economic infrastructure and technological leadership, while China is relying on the resilience of its people. In the U.S., if a leader fails, they can quickly be replaced, but China's system is different. If things go wrong, the people bear the burden, and if they can't endure it, the repression follows. Only when the pressure becomes too great and the repression fails, perhaps sparking a white paper revolution, might Xi Jinping end his retaliation. Xi has not caused much turmoil in the past 2 to 3 years. Do you think he can stay idle now? Thank you so much for watching. If you find this video helpful, please like it, drop a comment below, and hit the subscribe button right here. It really helps YouTube suggest my video to others. I'll be back with more content soon. Until then, be well.